Part one of this talk about the expansion of Brighton and Hove from 1875 to 1914 was about building, particularly of housing in the area. This part two is about the infrastructure and the facilities for the residents and visitors to the city. Here are some of the residents. It's a drawing from 1893 of the fishing from the old pier, which I presume means it looks much more like the West Pier rather than the even earlier Chain Pier. And here are some more, all in their Sunday best, outside the Gasfitters Arms in Tidy Street, one of the many pubs and beer houses that were converted from their early estate into private houses later in this period and beyond. Visitors to the town who got past the Queen's Head pub at the top of Queen's Road may have gone into somewhere like the William IV on the corner of Bond Street and Queen and Church Street. Of course, a lot of the visitors came to Brighton just for the day, and you'll see in a minute what that was like. But this boy is saying, well, can you have a shilling's worth if it's 3 shillings for 9 hours? Maybe 3 hours he thought was enough. But travel to Brighton, of course, was nothing like as comfortable as it is on the trains these days. Here are the crowds milling down West Street. This was the route from the station down to the seafront, along which a lot of the entertainment developed. You can see the sign on the left there for the Turkish Bath, which was eventually to become the Academy Cinema. And there were 3 cinemas altogether in West Street and 2 more just around the corner in North Street. But the visitors who came to Brighton, some of them regulars who had properties here and some who were just coming for a short stay, were listed in the newspaper on a weekly basis, and there are a lot of them. And what did they do when they got here? Well, they had plenty of choices that developed over this period. It became much more of a visitor location. The seaside was obviously popular with all types, but particularly with the lower orders, shall we say. You could go to the theatre. The cinema began towards the end of the period. Shopping was becoming a leisure activity as much as a necessity. And then, of course, there were the attractions in Brighton, such as the Daddy Longlegs and the aquarium and the museum, when you weren't out paddling. And the better off would stay in somewhere like the Grand or the Metropole hotels on the seafront, and they could pop out and enjoy the minstrel shows on the seafront. Here's another one. And they were obviously an important part of Brighton because they were painted by Walter Sickert. This is a painting from the Tate. But who hasn't been on a seaside holiday in this country who hasn't had to find some respite from weather like this? So where could they go? Well, to begin with, they could go to the theatre. The Theatre Royal had been there since the beginning of the 19th century. It had been upgraded in 1866 by one of the great theatre architects, C.J. Phillips, and the facade had been improved in 1894 by Charles Clayton of Clayton and Black, the local architects. Frank Matcham, the greatest theatre architect of the era, designed what had been the Eden and then the Grand Theatre in North Road, where Brighthelm is now. He also designed the Alhambra Opera House and Music Hall on the seafront, which became the Palladian Cinema in 1912 and was eventually replaced by the Brighton Centre. And there were 4 others: the Empire Theatre of Varieties opposite the Pavilion Gardens, the Pavilion and the Palace Pier theatres, and of course the Hippodrome, also designed not only by Frank Matcham, but by another great theatre architect, Bertie Crewe. But then entertainment began to expand with the first picture show of animated photographs outside London in this country in May 1896 in a building then known as the Pandora Gallery, later it became the Victoria Hall, and it's now the Melrose Restaurant next to Regency Square. Well, then proper cinemas, purpose-built cinemas started to arrive. This was the opening of the Duke of York's in September 1910, but it was only one of 15 picture palaces that opened between 1909 and 1912. And here are some of the others. The electric bioscope eventually became known as the Curzon, and it's where Waitrose is now. There were 3 in West Street. The Bijou Electric Empire in North Street is now Burger King. Most of the others, I think all the others, except the Duke of York's, of course, have disappeared. But the Duke of York's is now probably the oldest surviving continuous purpose-built cinema in the world. Shopping for practicalities took a new turn when the Co-op opened, primarily for residents, of course. The first one in 1888 in North Road. But shopping like this, in this wonderful arcade that used to run all the way around from the Theatre Royal on the extreme right of that picture, right round the corner into North Street, with Hannington's across the road on the left. This was really the first purpose-built department store, Palmyra stores in Western Road on the corner of Holland Road in Hove, which opened in 1873. But its advertising symbolized what was going to happen with shopping. All one's requirements can be obtained under one roof. It is evident, therefore, that shopping under such conditions becomes ideal and must result in a saving of time, trouble, and expense. Others got on to the same thing. Soper's was a draper's, rather like Hannington's, up at the other end of North Street, facing what is now Churchill Square. A little bit lower down on the corner of West Street was Smith's, and a little bit further down still was Leeson and Vokins, later known just as Vokins, which was still there until certainly the 1980s, if my memory serves correctly. And William Hill's along the Hove end of Western Road, which was founded in 1893 and also grew by accretion. Specific projects were some major building works like Hove Town Hall. Brighton had had a town hall since the 1830s, 20s even. But this was designed by Alfred Waterhouse, who had also designed the Metropole Hotel. So you can get an idea of what it was like. Of course, it's no longer there because it burnt down in the 1960s. The Borough Surveyor in Brighton, Philip Lockwood, replaced the old wooden railings along the seafront with metal railings with a wooden bar across the top at a cost of 15,700. You'll instantly recognize, perhaps if not the man on the right at the front, which is Magnus Folk himself, on Folk's Railway that ran from the Palace Pier along, when it was extended in 1884, as far as Paston Place, from which ran his daddy Longlegs, the Brighton and Rottingdean Seashore Electric Railway, which unfortunately closed in 1901 and was never revived after a new groin was built. In the town centre, the clock tower and urinal were the subject of a competition. These are the 3 winning entries, although you will recognise that none of them is actually the one that was built. And you can see here it being unveiled in 1888. The Madeira arches and the terrace above, the covered walk and the sheltered hall and the hydraulic lift were designed again by the Borough Surveyor, Philip Lockwood, and opened in 1890. As you know, they're now in a rather sad state, but here is an absolutely wonderful picture showing the shelter hall and the lift. The Palace Pier started in, well, construction started in 1891 on designs that were from 1890, but it didn't open until 1899. And one of the conditions for building it was that the old chain pier should be removed. Well, the weather took care of that. Not the only time this sort of thing has happened in Brighton. to appear. In December 1896, it was destroyed in a gale. The roads had to be widened to accommodate the growing traffic, particularly public transport. Western Road here was very narrow, as you can see, until it was widened in 1907. There had been baths in Brighton, Brill's baths down by Poole Valley, had been operated on a commercial basis, but the council built public baths. These are the Victoria baths in Park Street near Queen's Park. And this is a picture I took not long before the public baths in North Road were demolished. I took this in 1974. They'd opened in 1895, and you can see them under construction there. And there was class division even here, perhaps especially here. This is the gents' first class changing room. Now, this project never materialized. There were a few big ideas, there always have been in Brighton. This was huge. It was probably in imitation of the sort of casinos that were being built on the north coast of France, places like Deauville and Fécamp. This was to stretch all the way from Cavendish Place across the front of Bedford Square. I doubt if anybody would sanction anything like that these days, but it was designed by, again, local architects Clayton and Black in 1908. Let's take a moment just to look. There were some very eminent local Victorians. 5 mayors, each of whom served 3 terms in office, were all knighted. You can see John Cordy Burroughs, whose statue was unveiled in the 1870s. Then Sir Joseph Ewart, Sir John Blaker, Sir Charles Thomas Stanford of the Stanford estate at Preston Manor, and then Sir Herbert Carden, whose name is remembered in various streets. There were 4 key civil servants. The town clerk for 23 years was Francis Tilstone, who had been employed from the age of about 20 for 25 years before he became town clerk within the council. There were 2 borough surveyors, Philip Lockwood, who was the surveyor for over 30 years from 1858, who is immediately followed by Francis May for the next 15 years. And then Sir Arthur Newsholme, who doesn't get much of a look in this talk, but he was very much influential in clearing away slums and cesspits and so on in the area, and ended up being the medical officer of health equivalent to the ones who stand alongside Boris Johnson in presentations about COVID. And there were 4 others that I picked out. Arthur Wagner was the vicar of St. Paul's, but was responsible for commissioning a number of churches around the town. Magnus Falk, of course, was a serious engineer and inventor and entrepreneur. And then 2 of my favorites were the Hove pioneer filmmakers, Albert Smith and James Williamson. Now, the utilities, water, sewerage, gas, electricity, telephone and public transport, shown here in this picture at the Goldstone pumping station. And you can see that everybody turned up for the major events, that probably most of the dignitaries of Brighton and Hove at the time can be seen in that picture. And this was the nobility, the local gentry mixing with the workers at the second well that was sunk at Goldstone Bottom in 1876. The waterworks had been taken over by then by the corporation in 1872, and the pumping station was extended in 1884. There were reservoirs all over the city, stretching from Shoreham to Falmer, 18 of them altogether. This was the biggest, still there in Islingwood Road, with a capacity of 2 million gallons. And it's commemorated by this pub in Islingwood Road, which I'm sure you know, Constant Service, named after the Brighton, Hove and Preston Constant Service Waterworks, because by then the whole of Brighton had access to piped water, which had cost £12,500 to arrange. Sewers were being built. The network that had started in the mid-1860s was completed by 1874. You can see how they were built by a cut and cover process. But they didn't skimp on things like the Rottingdean sewer outfall, which was cleverly disguised. Or is it a bit like not showing how utilitarian something was? The electricity service had started with an experiment by Charles Siemens of the famous Siemens company that still exists, with street lighting in King's Road. It was just an experiment and it wasn't persisted, but a man called Robert Hammond started a supply from a Gloucester Road power station in the grounds of the Regent Iron Foundry. Magnus Folk put electric lighting into the Royal Pavilion in 1883. The Brighton Electric Light Company, which had recently been formed, bought out Hammond's business in 1885, and it became the Brighton and Hove Electric Light Company, one of the not entirely consistent examples of the way that the two towns collaborated or shared facilities. Electric lighting was inaugurated on King's Road in 1891, and there's actually a plaque on this lamppost opposite Regency Square that commemorates it. You can see Joseph Hewitt there. We saw his picture a minute ago. He was the mayor at the time. He also, if you watched part one, was involved in opening parks. Brighton Corporation Electricity Works opened a new power station in 1891 on the corner of Spring Gardens and New Road, and it took over the Brighton and Hove Electric Light Company, the private enterprise, in 1894. This chimney on the right was built for the works, and this is what it looked like inside, a recently discovered picture. And power supply, of course, couldn't keep pace with the expansion of the city, so the Brighton A power station opened down at Southwick, which is where there is still the remnants of power. Hove had its own electric light company, which installed lighting in Hove in 1894, and its works were on the corner of Cromwell Road and Holland Road, and could be seen, the chimney anyway, could be seen from the cricket ground. The telephone came along. There had been a telegraph service from London to Brighton in 1851, but the first telephone exchange was opened by who else? Magnus Folk. In 1882 in West Street. And the first trunk line opened in December 1884, put in by the United Telephone Company, and they advertised as enabling any subscriber in London to talk to any subscriber in Brighton, or any subscriber in Brighton to talk to any subscriber in London. Amazing. And for the present, the wire is open free to subscribers at both ends. There were 138 subscribers in the first telephone directory, published in 1885. And in 1889, the United Telephone Company merged with others to form a national telephone company. By the following year, there were 600 subscribers in Brighton, with an exchange in Duke Street. This was a female activity operating the telephones, always was. There were 17 operators, and you can only see 2 men out of the 21 people in that picture. Brighton Corporation was one that took up the possibility that the central government introduced to establish a municipal telephone service. Only 6 towns in the country did so. Brighton did so in 1903. The only one of those 6 that survives is the one in Hull. And Brighton sold out to the post office in 1906. And of course, eventually it was the post office that took over the entire telephone service. Horse buses had started in 1840, and in 1884, most of them amalgamated to form the Brighton, Hove and Preston United Omnibus Company. And the headquarters were in Conway Street, which is still the central depot for the buses. There was a horse tram, originally a steam-driven tram, but then horses replaced steam, which was a curious inversion of the usual way of doing it, that ran from Shoreham Station along to the Hove boundary at Aldrington, then not integrated in Hove. And it ran all this way along the sea, along just behind the harbour, and then along Church Road as far as what is now Brighton, Hove Museum. Hove actually had a trolleybus service in 1914. It ran from the station, as you can see, down to down George Street and to and ended at St Albans. There it is. And it was free, but it only lasted 4 weeks. So they went to a lot of trouble for that. But it was Brighton that really had the proper tram network. This is Lewis Road, the tram tracks being laid near St Martin's Church. Those wood blocks cost 12 7d per square yard. Thought you'd like to know that. Here it is at Preston Circus outside the Hare and Hounds. There is another shot of it being of the complex junction at that point. And here's the first tram coming round the corner on the 25th of November 1901. These are the tram routes. They radiated essentially from Old Steam out towards the more or less to the perimeters of the built-up area at the time. They did not go west into Hove. They did not go east along the seafront. The tickets cost a penny going up Dyke Road, or twopence out to the top of, what does that say? Oh, Beaconsfield Road. This was the loop that ran around Beaconsfield Road and came back down Ditchling Road. And they went out to the boundary of the town. There's another of the tram shelters, which was it's still there, but it's about a couple of 100 yards further down the road. And I used to live just in the middle of that block, just further up. In 1903, there was a very long article in the Building News about the building that was going on in Brighton. You can see it's slightly more than a whole page of quite small print. And one of the things that it said is that the facilities afforded by the corporation for rendering these northern heights of the town accessible by means of the splendid service of electric tramcars have been the means of rapidly developing the building estates and really of indirectly spoiling the scenery of the downs. And what is the class of building that has been erected? The interminable rows of commonplace red brick and slated roof dwellings, which are rendering the suburbs of London in every direction so distressingly monotonous and wearisome. Well, they were judgments that persisted for quite a long time. I mean, these two quotes about the architectural dreariness of Hove's well-planned but ugly Victorian avenues and Victorian mediocrity. I don't think that's mediocre. I think that's rather attractive. Ventnor Villas in 1905. But the quotes came from, believe it or not, the first publication in 1946 by the Regency Society. But we were entering the modern age, or they were entering the modern age. Buses were becoming motorized. Aeroplanes were flying over the West Pier and even landing on Hove lawns. Shoreham Airport, Brighton Aerodrome as it was then known, opened in 1911, although the first flight there had actually been in 1910. Magnus Falk again invented an electric car, 140 years ahead of his time almost. And of course, cars became de rigueur for the well-off. Here are a couple arriving at Preston Manor. And this is, of course, what the car is today. This is traffic approaching Seven Dials. And cars parked nose to tail on both sides of the road, and cycle lanes blocked. I leave you to think what you will about that. Well, thank you for watching. If you do have any questions or comments, there is my email address. You can write to that. I'll be very happy, and I will reply to everything. And if you want to contact the Regency Society, there is the address. And you might, if you aren't already a member, you might like to think about joining. And we hope that there will be live lectures at some point. There are already, however, a number of pre-recorded lectures that you can watch on the Society's website. So thank you very much for watching.